Hey everyone, welcome back to Cash Only, the #1 financial crimes podcast, at least on my block. Before we go any further, please don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already. Every little bit helps in supporting our podcast. I'm Jules.
I'm Connor.
And today we have a dear friend, Lila, joining us. So we know Lila all the way back from our grad school days. Lila Green is the co-president of Women in International Security Western Region, also known as Wise West, and a good friend of both Connor and I. Welcome, Lila.
Hey guys.
Welcome, Lila. Hey, thanks for
having
joining us.
me. Yeah, I'm thrilled and honored. Can't wait.
So we invited Lila to the show today because she has a different take on this whole GameStop debacle, and it's one Connor and I haven't really thought too much about. So backtracking a little bit, just a very high overview of what's going on in case you have not seen the news or read anything. When 2021 started, I don't think anyone would have guessed that GameStop, of all things, would have been the hottest investment of the year. So if you don't know, GameStop stock has surged more than 1,500% this year. And this is largely due to a Reddit group called wallstreetbets. Essentially, there was one user on wallstreetbets that was investing really hard on GameStop, and he just really believed that the price would go up. At one point, this guy actually posted a screenshot of his portfolio showing that he was like $34,000 down on GameStop. But he just kept like doubling down on his investment. He really believed it would go up. Eventually, GameStop started receiving some good news, some good press about increased earnings. The co-founder of Chewy.com said that he was taking a stake in GameStop and wanted to make it a sort of Amazon rival, but for gaming. And some other stuff came out. So this is where things start to get really interesting. Users of Reddit's wallstreetbets actually discovered that GameStop was one of the most shorted stocks on the market, with more shares actually being shorted than actually exist. So for those unfamiliar with shorting, it essentially means that you borrow stock from someone else with the promise of paying them back in the same stock. You then immediately sell that stock with the hope of it going down so you can buy back in at a lower price, repay the person or entity or whoever that you borrowed it from, and pocket the change. Now, if the stock goes up, you're essentially shit out of luck, right? Because you're on the hook to cover the difference. Obviously, the higher it goes, the more money you lose out on. So with all these Redditors buying up GameStop, this eventually led to a short squeeze, meaning the stock price rapidly rose due to the lack of supply and excess demand for the GameStop stock due to all the short sellers needing to cover their positions. As a result, the hedge funds that were shorting GameStop have lost billions of dollars, with some even having to shut their doors because of their losses. And that's the story you normally hear on the news. This David versus Goliath, amateur trader sticking it to Wall Street. But Lila, when most people think about these hedge funds, where these hedge funds get their capital, they think high net worth individuals, rich people, right? But that's not the only place hedge funds actually borrow from.
Exactly. So largely hedge funds are built up of a diversified network of wealthy investors, but amongst that network will be companies that invest their employees' pension funds. So for example, all three of us work for companies that have retirement funds, 401ks, that sort of thing. And then largely anyone who works in the public sector will have a 401k or a lifetime pension based on their salary, that sort of thing. And that money doesn't just come out of thin air, and it's not coming out of some, savings account. It's coming out of something like a pension fund that is being invested on the stock market. And largely those get invested in hedge funds because they have these great returns. And as all of us know, being on the financial crimes end of the financial sector, inflation is going up past income, and it has been since all of us were born. And so the only way to have a meaningful income once you're older, I believe it's called a fixed income, is to have it be invested in a high return stock. And now the thing about that is that largely pensioners don't have a choice. Their company makes that choice. And in your 401k, you can diversify it on your own. But again, that's usually managed by a company. Mine is managed by a company. I don't know if you guys have started your 401ks yet or if your company is doing it for you. But chances are they're making suggestions and you trust them based on their business acumen and based on the position that they're in. Like, that is their job. And so someone could be really cynical and say, well, it's incumbent on the investor to be aware of what they're investing in or that sort of thing. And to a certain extent, okay, fine. But larger than that is that people don't have infinite amounts of time, especially nowadays. And if you're paying someone to manage your money, you're paying them to spend their time making smart choices. That's the whole point of paying them. Or you don't have a choice and your company is making that choice and they've decided to be the representative of your pension fund. So that's where it comes in, like the quote unquote man. The man could be a company like Amazon or like Facebook or whatever, but they're investing the retirement fund of their workers. And that is the gamut from the person who is a administrative assistant to your rank and file, programmer, all the people at that company. And I just wanted, the thing that I put out there is I wanted everyone to remember that there are better ways. If we want to really change the system, if we want to create equity, this is not the way to do it. The slash and burn methodology has been tried for hundreds of years in a variety of ways, from literally barbarians at the gate to this sort of digital barbarian at the gate. And it's just, we've seen it time and time again that it's not effective. It has short-term benefit, no long-term benefit. And largely, I'm just going to throw it out there. I don't personally see this as some kind of Robin Hood style event. I don't see anyone reinvesting this money into the hands of people who really need it. I see it more as like replacing one incredibly rich financial benefactor with another.
Yeah, it really sounds like this sort of was like a short-term middle finger to Wall Street that sort of revealed this. It's like a lack of regulation or potential for excess volatility in the market. But like I said, it was really sort of a short-term middle finger to him without eliciting real change. It sort of reminds me of, like, in Portland, there are these riots, and that's. I heard Bill Maher, I think, sometime this weekend, he made a very good point where it feels really good to write FU on a federal building, but that's not how you make legislative change. And so that just sort of is an equivalent that came into my head as I was researching this, in that it sort of seems like they're not really eliciting real change. They're kind of a few people, made a great deal of money. A couple people kind of got screwed over in this, but this really isn't sticking it to Wall Street like they thought they were going to do, and probably as they intended on doing.
Exactly. Like, sticking it to Wall Street is going to be in the hands of Janet Yellen and the changes that she makes in regulations. And I'm personally totally here for it, really excited for it. That's how we're going to build equity.
Right.
And I totally agree with you, Connor, that it's a short-term middle finger and it can feel really satisfying, but it's tantamount to virtue signaling. It's like, look what I did. It's like posting your virtue on Facebook, but then not substantively changing your lifestyle or changing the way that you behave. And it's such a cliche that, again, we've all grown up with, like, think locally, act globally. But if we all create equity in our own lives, that is going to ripple out. If every single person did it, that's equity right there. And so, I mean, it's just kind of frustrating. I don't know how you guys feel, but it's getting increasingly frustrating even reading the news, because I don't see this as something positive.
Well, that brings an interesting point, right? Is why should people care? So a lot of things that I'm seeing on the internet, especially in comment sections, is like, if you're choosing to invest your money, you should know the risks, right? So why do you think people don't care?
So again, I'm going to circle back to what I originally said, is that we anyone who has a retirement fund is either beholden to somebody who is managing it for them, who is chartered through their employer, or the employer is managing it for them outside of their control. You know, a lot of unions do this. They manage the retirement funds of their union members and then distribute it. And that's kind of part of being in the union. There's a system of trust, like that social contract. And this is something that came up a lot during the Trump administration, that a lot of people were referencing as getting increasingly degraded, like exponentially degraded. You can't even call it slow, but the social contract was breaking down so rapidly. And then COVID accelerated it to the point where we were starting to see borderline chaos and anarchy. And society thrives and requires a social contract where compassion and empathy are part of the contract. And sorry to say that word over and over again, but I'm getting concerned, and I don't mean to get ultra philosophical, but I'm getting concerned about that this is just another indicator of the kind of breakdown of not social norms, because that's too soft of language, but the breakdown of civil society. And some folks out there might be like, well, good, let's burn it all down. And it's like, okay, when someone burns something down, someone else has to clean it up and build it again. Burning things down, breaking shit is not brave. It just makes you a little thug and a tyrant. It doesn't make you an effective change maker, unless you are like, I will personally burn it down. I will personally put the infrastructure back into building it up and making it better for everybody. And so far, I haven't seen anyone say that. You know, when I'm reading interviews with the founder of Wall Street Bets, he seems to be kind of like quasi morally affected, having like these marginal philosophical conversations with himself, but more bemused. And again, objectifying the experiences of others for your own kind of weird schadenfreude of destruction, it's not going to change anything. It's not, ultimately also a lot of these hedge funds are backed by varieties of safety nets with each other. They build up their own networks of safety nets. All these people are just going to go get jobs somewhere else. Like, I lived in New York, in fact, when the big financial crisis happened in 2008. And weirdly, coincidentally, it was right around my birthday. So on my birthday, I was touring all of the different historical sites in New York where the where different things in the Revolutionary War happened. And one of them down in Wall Street, and I'm headed down there with my friend. And we get off the train and we're walking toward this particular site. And there was a man, I'll never forget it. He was sitting on the steps in front of the stock exchange, and he looked like close to my age. And his face was in his hands, and he was just crying. And you know, he had all the earmarks of your classic douchebaggy type guy, but it didn't make me feel good to see him destroyed, because I realized, like, that is just a rank and file dude who's probably working 16 hours a day. And maybe he was pulling in some decent money, but the guys who are making millions and millions were not affected. They all backed each other up in the end. And so the only way to effectively change things is long-term solutions. And again, it sounds boring. And the thing is that equity is boring. Things like this are going to be boring. And maybe we should all rethink our addiction to being stimulated rather than anything else. Like, what is this all about? Is it really about leveling the playing field? Is it really about helping the little guy? Because if you just turn the little guy into the big guy, there's millions of people sitting in the middle whose lives haven't changed at all effectively.
So just to check my understanding of everything you've just said, what you're saying is, in the larger scheme of things, it may look like a lot of these hedge funds are the ones that are being hurt, but at the end of the day, they have a large enough support system. They're going to be fine. It's the little people that have maybe some money in these in their pension funds, right, that are going to be the ones that really suffer.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully, I have read that there have been a number of safeguards put in place since 2008 due to the amount of money that people lost in the financial crisis back then. Because again, as we all know, retrospectively, that bailout money did not go to refilling any of the losses that average people, middle class people experienced. It didn't go into pulling people out of the foreclosures that they were in. It went directly into bonuses. It went directly into salaries. It went directly into the retirement funds of these hedge fund folks or any of these investors, like these multi-million-dollar investors. And then they also have their own funds heavily diversified across properties and non-liquid assets that protect them. So again, like, I don't know. I mean, I hope that it's becoming clearer and this is helping everybody understand that if someone is so hard-hearted at this point that they say something as oversimplified as, well, if you make investments, you need to understand the risk. All that is like you are parroting the person that you are saying you are sticking it to. You are becoming the thing that you hate. It's very Shakespearean.
Well, it also doesn't help, right? The fact that a lot of times people, if you have your money in a pension fund, you don't really know what exactly is going on. I mean, there are certain funds where you can kind of have a little more control over it, but for most investors, right, you don't know what's going on. You probably don't even really understand it, and that's why you let things like investment funds or mutual funds, hedge funds, all these things take control, because you're just like, Jesus, take the wheel. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah. And you know what I would love to see, if this group got together and then they started helping folks, older folks, young folks first investing their money, helping people understand the way these markets work and how they can diversify and how maybe they can protect themselves and put their money into slower growth, but more sustainable growth funds or bonds even. You know, we could put our money into more bonds in general and then help build the infrastructure of this country. That's how the United States got built back in between wars and after wars. You know, certainly not the most recent ones because our infrastructure is completely falling apart, but that's a totally different podcast. But I would like to see these dudes put their money where their mouth is. You know, if they really want to stick it to the man and they really want to help the little guy, I hope the little guy is someone other than themselves.
Right. To take a step back, you had mentioned norms a couple times previously, and I think this really illustrates, and especially with the last 4 years in the Trump administration, the importance of these norms and safeguards and sort of expectations of self-regulation that are not necessarily enshrined in law, but are things that we've typically done because it's worked for us. And then a big break from that was sort of Robinhood and retail stock trading, and the democratization of the ability to buy and sell stocks. And here's a bunch of people who don't understand some of the inherent risks, who don't fully understand how markets work, why stocks are shorted, the results of stocks becoming overvalued. And then so they sort of, they skirt those regulations and those norms, and they do something like this. And ultimately, just as you had mentioned, there was a bemusement and sort of a sense of schadenfreude in that this was really counterproductive to any movement of institutional change. It's going to maintain the status quo and maybe cement things in even further how they are. And at the end, as we mentioned way back at the beginning, like this was a nice big FU to Wall Street, but in the end, it's harming the retail, the Reddit investors. It's harming themselves and their own pensions and their families' pensions and the overall cause for social change and institutional change. And it's really it's assisting the big fat cats. And just as you had mentioned a second ago, the rank and file people are hurting just the same as the rest of us. And so it's a very interesting illustration and culmination of this big change that we see in the market and sort of our civilization kind of pushing away norms that are not institutionalized, like in legislation and law.
Absolutely. And you reminded me of an important point. If anyone thinks that they're not going to be paying for the shortfall of others, they're mistaken. Like look at our healthcare industry, for example. You know, we have forgiven this power into insurance companies, and then they're the decision makers about how much something costs. And so you could say, well, you know, I'm young and healthy. What does it matter? and it does matter because you end up paying for it. Like the incredibly high bills that you end up paying as your co-pays, or the insurance expenses that your company pays for could be far lower if everyone was more healthy in general, or if we had some kind of publicly managed system that we had more oversight into. You know, everyone pays. So if someone goes into an ER and they don't have insurance and they have a healthcare emergency and the hospital pays for them, that gets put back into the costs of others. You know, if someone's getting a medication for $300, like let's say insulin, $300 per dose, and they're paying for it personally, but somehow they can't, and they shortfall in other arenas. Like the entirety of these exorbitant expenses that are benefiting a very, very, very small percentage of private companies and the people associated with them here in the United States. It all has to do with the fact that we've forgiven these responsibilities and not taken them upon ourselves because they're complicated and they take effort and they take understanding and they take time, and they're not, this is a term that I cannot stand that people use in our sector so much, but they're not sexy. It's not enticing. It's not scintillating. It's, you know, it's not coming out of a blockbuster movie, but this is reality. And I think the kind of overstimulated nature of everybody's expectations of what life should be is we all need to take a collective breath and enjoy the silence for a minute and really rethink these things. Because also, this is also a huge cliche, but not everyone's going to be young forever. And someday you are going to count. We're all going to end up counting on someone else to help us eventually. And so sowing this kind of like horrible karma is not a good idea. But another thing that you brought up that I think is really important is about the democratization of stock trading, which I think is wonderful. You know, I want it to be clear that I'm not saying that this isn't signaling an incredibly huge change that needs to happen or has needed to happen for a while. Showing the holes in the system is important, but it's not necessary to have utter chaos to demonstrate holes. I believe that people have been pointing them out meaningfully for a few years, if not a few decades at this point. And so we need to be able to get away from absolute anarchy to point out holes. Like the Trump administration was basically one large example of pointing out a variety of holes and vulnerabilities in the system. And, you know, we could have done without that because I believe we already knew that they were there. It's just to oversimplify it, nobody wanted to listen. So how are we going to change those things? And one thing is teaching others. You know, democratizing knowledge, I think, is incredibly important. So I'm hoping that a lot of these guys, after they come down from the high, will start to think, maybe I can teach others. So keeping the knowledge to yourself is also just becoming the thing that you purport yourself to be battling against. And hopefully it's not kind of this Faustian bargain that all these dudes are getting involved in. It's better to democratize knowledge and then have everybody get involved and take meaningful steps in the right direction.
You bring up a really good point about profiting off the fall of others. And it's so interesting because I guess the way I think of shorting, right, is literally profiting off the downfall of others. You're putting money, hoping to make money off the downfall of a company or certain stock, which basically equates a company,
Absolutely.
right? And
Yeah.
these hedge funds, what makes hedge funds really interesting is that they have the ability to use high risk tactics, such as short selling stocks and making these really wildly speculative positions that normally you wouldn't be able to if you were in like a mutual fund or something else that's a lot more regulated. You talk about the democratization of education or the ability to have empathy, right? How do you have hedge funds and all these people that are looking to short stocks as well as that empathy? Can they coexist?
I'm just going to go out there and say it. No. If your main source of income is someone else's failure, then no. Because there is nearly no empathy in the pursuit of somebody else's failure. Now, there are these real outlier moments, right? Like pursuing Hitler's failure is pure empathy at the time, right? And so if you're pursuing the failure of a human demon, then that's understandable. But those are outlier moments. The rest of the time, we still have to remember that all these people are human beings. It seems sometimes impossible to believe with the behaviors that you're seeing, but we are getting increasingly distanced from those human feelings and seeing each other as real, as people, as someone who needs to wake up and get things done and maybe take care of somebody else and survive and live. And so when you're, I mean, forgive me, it's like you asked a great question. Can these things coexist? And I don't think it's possible. So, you know, a lot of other jobs over time become obsolete. And I think that it's not a bad thing to think of a particular type of financial behavior becoming obsolete as a bad thing. We can move, there are ways to make money. There are ways to make a lot of money that don't count on somebody else's demise or suffering. It can count on purely other people's benefit. And now we could move in totally philosophical territory, which would be a much longer podcast about, well, do we need to have wealth? Does there need to be this, you know, chasm between the rich and the poor? Does there need to be poor? Can everybody be middle class? I mean, we would be talking for the rest of our lives. But for the short term, I think that no, and even more so, we need to reinfuse the educational system with morals, ethics, and empathy. I know that in MBA programs, they teach business ethics, but I have a hard time believing a lot of the people walk out of their MBA thinking of that as a cornerstone of their future behavior.
Regarding that, you mentioned regarding like ethics, and you had mentioned sort of obsolescence. To play devil's advocate, GameStop was sort of like the Blockbuster of like retail gaming. They were very well on their way out, and so it's I understand shorting, and you're betting against a company, you're betting against a company's human beings, and you're really betting against, you know, their success in the market. But if they're on their way out, is just from a sort of maybe moving empathy a little bit out of it, that's a logical and expected analytical move to be making in the market. These stocks were well on their way out, and I can't remember the guy's name who owns Chewy, who just bought into it, that was trying to pull them more into the 21st century. They had, like, I picture GameStop as chained up in a mall that has, you know, 6 stores, like a failing mall. And so like we kind of knew they were on their way out, and even when they were in business, they had really sort of not a great reputation, especially with their buybacks. That was sort of a meme of its own. So I guess what I'm wondering is just playing devil's advocate. I mean, that seems like on the financial, if we're talking about the markets and protecting the markets and valuing stocks at their true value, maybe short selling the GameStop price was the right thing to do, because now we know that when we put the short squeeze on it, now we sort of have a bubble. We have a highly inflated price. GameStop is simply not worth whatever it last traded at, $400 or $350. It's this massive bubble, and that's highly volatile. That's unstable. And so to look at the short selling as only betting against a business or an enterprise or a group of people, I wonder if that's too myopic, if we need to look at it both on this empathy side as they are humans and on sort of the business side as this is the proper move to make in the market.
Yeah, so I understand what you're saying, and I'll just make it clear. I actually like GameStop. I actually shop there, and I actually bought the GameStop membership so that I get a little discount every time I buy a game. I like the brick and mortar store and
so she's
brick and mortar
biased.
experiences. Dude, I'm so biased. I'm actually totally on Wall Street Bets. No, it's not. I barely even engage with Reddit. And you know, I'll just tell you guys something. When I found out that the tagline of Wall Street Bets was like 4chan found a Bloomberg terminal, I think my eye roll literally touched every section of my brain.
We can make a whole we can make a whole pod on just 4chan on its own.
Oh my God. I think I'd probably end up having some kind of like minor aneurysm, but I'll be here for it. If you guys, if I'm like properly sauced up in advance, I think I could live through it. But anyways, Connor, to kind of discuss what you just said, I think, you're making a point, and I would counter it by saying, can we not let things go gracefully? Can we not let things die a natural death? And I have seen in my lifetime so many things that were so nostalgic for me go away, especially living in the Bay Area. I've had to see a lot of the things that I held very dear in my heart completely disintegrate and disappear. And the landscape of this area has fundamentally changed culturally. And it's a huge bummer for me. But I do feel kind of on the scales like the pros and the cons of these sorts of changes. And change is inevitable, and businesses come and businesses go, some faster than others. And the way, GameStop was not properly evolving, and it was showing in their business model. And that's also something that is incumbent on them as a business. They need to respond when they start to become obsolete. And it's interesting, I read an article like earlier today, I believe it was in The Guardian. It was an interview with the son of the founder of GameStop, because he is on wallstreetbets. And he was just thrilled to see all of this happen. And I'm sure like he has an emotional investment in the process. But, ironically, he came from a rich family. His dad owned GameStop and then a number of other businesses. And so I feel like it's this also weird world of people thinking of themselves as the little guy when they're not. But I guess I'm kind of digressing from the original point. The point is that, do hedge fund managers, are they just fulfilling the responsibility to like identify the actual value of a stock? And maybe if that was their whole thing, reevaluating, almost like having, when a house gets appraised,
right,
or anything gets appraised. When you go on Antiques Roadshow and you think that you just showed up with a Picasso, and it's actually like a total piece of crap that some kid made in a kindergarten, and it's not anybody's fault. It's just reality, and you kind of have to go into that gracefully.
I was just based on what you said, like when your own well-being is based on your appraisal, then it's just bound for corruption. I mean, that's just the recipe for corruption. So I totally understand what you're saying, how that's different than appraising a property when you're trying to specifically make a stock move in a direction.
If it was a neutral move,
right?
It was totally neutral, fine. But if you are counting on the fundamental devaluing of something, it also is prone to your point, corruption, and prone to something maybe being over devalued. Perhaps they were starting to strip GameStop of value that it actually hadn't lost yet. Like they were saying that they were over shorting it past stocks that existed, hoping that it would fall. Like, and again, the fact that this behavior is still happening when we are, what year is this? 2021, and 2008 was now 14 years ago.
Yeah.
And before that with Enron, which I think happened in the year 2000 or 2001. How many times are we going to see this behavior before we realize that it needs to change?
Right.
It's definitely an uphill battle, right? So some closing thoughts as we wrap up on the podcast is we kind of talked about how hedge funds try to make money off of the losses of others, right? So how do you I guess encourage, how do you try to change the mind of people who have that mindset? They're trying to make make a quick buck, right? Even not necessarily just the large hedge funds, but the smaller people who do these shortings, right? It's not all just hedge funds. It's a lot of just retail investors as well. How do you try to change their mind and tell them, this should not be happening?
Sure. So on the New York subway, there's a saying, if you see something, say something. And I've kind of started ascribing this to every social movement that we've seen crop up in the last few years that's truly exploded, like Me Too, like BLM, like this. We need to hold each other accountable. If we see something, we need to say something to each other. We need to be the hosts of good behavior to each other. I think that this was much more common back in the day when there was a lot more face-to-face interaction. And then increasingly, I'm not, by no means am I calling the internet, a demon. I think it's fantastic, and I think it's been a great equalizer. But I do think that we need to return to a place where we can openly speak to each other about morality and ethics, but we don't want to like proselytize to each other in a paternal or maternal way. It's not about chastising each other. It's not about canceling each other. This whole kind of pointing the finger, cancel culture, let's embarrass and shame someone into annihilation. Why do we need to do that? Why everyone collectively needs to take a really, really big breath. I'm going to say it again, and think in longer term solutions, because just pissing each other off constantly is clearly not working. And so perhaps we need to be the hosts of good behavior to each other. And I don't mean shaming each other, because there's a lot of evidence that shame doesn't work as a remediary tool. It's more about hosting each other through life and kind of questioning each other. Just as much as we're questioning the system, let's question each other's behavior and be good friends to each other. And then again, this is a boring topic, but it is extremely important. The way that the education system in our country has been absolutely gutted in the last 40 years needs to stop. And I'm hoping that with this new administration, and also with our First Lady, Jill Biden, wanting to take a huge hand in the reformation of the United States public education system, we're going to see some meaningful change where that's concerned, because civics education has just totally been voided from public schools, even in nice communities. And so we need to add it back in. Perhaps we need to add in fundamental economics, and it can start at a young age. I've already started teaching my son, and he's only 8. And it's not because I, want him to go to Harvard or anything like that. It's because I think that it's important. I think that we all need to be hosts to each other about giving each other the fullest life, because you can't download a tremendous amount of information into someone and expect them to change overnight. It's just, that's not the way any biological system works. And we are still, no matter what we would like to think, no matter how advanced we have become, we're still biological things that require a certain amount of time to embody change. And if we do it in a compassionate manner rather than a punitive manner, and I think that this covers a lot of different territories, moving away from the punitive, moving into the reformatory, compassionate methodology. And then, it could be like, well, how do we move into compassion? It's going to take the people who already have it becoming hosts of it, and it kind of proliferating from there. If we can proliferate anger, we can also proliferate compassion.
I like that a lot.
Sweet.
Proliferate compassion, not nuclear weapons.
Yeah. You'll be hard pressed to find people that don't support compassion.
A huge part of what we all do professionally anyway, so it's pretty natural.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome,
Nuke
Lila.
of the
Thank
mind.
you. What's that?
Oh, thank you guys. I said the nuke of the mind.
Nuke of the mind. I love it. You're gonna have to get these trademarked.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I just TM'd it. This is evidence that I TM'd it.
Yeah, that's right.
Lila, do you have
right.
anything or anybody you want to shout out?
Yeah, I mean, first I want to shout the two of you out, Jules and Connor. Thank you for having me on. It's always a joy to talk to you both, and I feel really honored to be on the pod. And speaking of podcasts, oh, thank you. I'd love to, if anyone wants to hear a podcast hosted by me talking about other sorts of things that are kind of more generalized and not focused just on the financial crime sector, Wise West has one called Show of Force. And we tend to release every 2 weeks, and you can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. We do like comments. It helps boost our profile and helps get us more listeners. And more than anything, we just want to have people have some fun while they're learning stuff about policy, diplomacy, and national security. And then shout out to all the people out there who have allowed themselves to think a little bit more dynamically after all of this, not get caught up in the hype, because hype is just so seductive. You know, we all get caught in it at some point. But I'm hoping that all of us have learned something. All of us that are young, old, and wherever on the spectrum have learned something from what we went through in the Trump administration, that we'd like to move to something better.
Absolutely. And I will definitely attest to Show of Force. It's an excellent podcast. It's very interesting. You guys should
Thank
check
you.
it out. Of course. Thanks for making a good podcast.
Try it.
Oh, man. Well, we'll let you get your nature on this Sunday afternoon.
Oh, I know. It's so beautiful today. So thank you for that. And I hope you guys are getting your nature on in your respective parts of the globe, and stay safe and healthy out there.
It's 30 degrees, freezing rain here. I might not be getting my nature on today.
I'm going to go sunbathe right now.
Oh, no. Okay. Stay inside. Get your hot cocoa on.
Exactly.
Nice.
Okay.
Have a good one. Thank you,
Good
Lila.
one. Thank you so much, Lila. It was great
Thanks,
to talk with you
guys.
again.
Thank you, Connor.
You too. Take care. Bye.
Peace.
Bye. See ya.